kind of the usability aspects of Microsoft Teams versus security, and kind of striking the balance between them. So before we really get going, we typically just run through a bit about who we are. Now, my name's Luke Evans. I've been working in technology for quite some time, specifically in the Microsoft stack. So for my sins, I did about 6 years at Microsoft in pre-sales and support. In SharePoint is where I've come from. I've been a consultant / architect ever since then, and I've been primarily working on collaborative tools, so Microsoft Teams. But the things that really interest me are really the security and identity side of Microsoft 365. And I worked from user bases kind of from a couple hundred to a few hundred thousands when I was back at Microsoft doing SharePoint. Now, I did say I was more glamorous than Zoe earlier, but she has got one thing over me, and I'm sure she'll run through it now.
Thanks, Luke. So I'm Zoe Wilson. I'm the Director of Innovation and Customer Success, and I've had the pleasure of working with Luke at Agilysys for the last 4.5 years. I'm also a Microsoft MVP for Office Apps and Services, newly minted, I would say, so I've only been an MVP for about 20 days, and I'm still getting used to introducing myself, which is always interesting. Now, I've worked with, my background's with SharePoint. I've worked with SharePoint for more than 15 years. I've lost count. And the bit that's always interested me is kind of the intersection between technology and people. So understanding what people's problems are and how we can use technology to help that. I am very passionate about this stuff. I spend a huge amount of time helping colleagues and customers and people across the community understand what the art of the possible is. I get really excited about things like accessibility and all of the great stuff that you can do in Microsoft 365. And I get involved in loads of kind of women in tech communities and diversity and things like that as well. Now, before you move on, Luke, just on the bottom of the screen, there is my Twitter handle and LinkedIn. I'd love for you all to kind of reach out, give me a follow, come and connect. Let's stay in touch. Right, okay, so this is the agenda that we're going to cover with you today, and hopefully you enjoy it. What I would say is that both Luke and I, we prefer to have a more interactive session, so if you have got questions, just ping them in the chat as we go through. We will try to answer them as we move along. So we're going to start off, first of all, by looking at Teams today and some of the key use cases, or some of the key things that I want from Teams. If I'm an end user, how do I want to be able to use it? Then we'll talk a little bit about some of the responsibilities for security. So whose responsibility is it actually to, to keep things safe? Is it ours? Is it our organisations? Is it Microsoft's? And then Luke's going to walk us through some of the technical components that are available from a security perspective, which will help keep our end users safe as they work and collaborate in teams. And then lastly, we're going to finish up with a bit of a summary, some recommendations, and time for any questions that you've got that we might not have covered as we move through the session. All right, so if we look at Teams today, I mean, the growth of Teams has been absolutely staggering. So, in 2020, Microsoft added 95 million users, which is just absolutely unbelievable. And actually there was, so we've got this new stat at the bottom. So 145 million daily active users. It's just absolutely incredible when you think about how many people are using this every day. I'll let you talk through the rest, Luke.
Oh, sorry, I was jumping the gun there, Zoe, is what I would say. I think the big ones for me are certainly basically the number of organizations using Teams, so the number of instances Teams out there. So it's tenfold from 2017 to 2020. So imagine all the different kind of tenants out there, all the different configurations, all the different settings. There's so many different possibilities. And I think certainly COVID has kind of drove that to overdrive. So the final one I would always call out is basically the amount of growth, basically in really the first lockdown, or the first kind of big lockdown, I would say, and it's an 894% growth. And it's, well, we just started Zoom for a bit of fun, but it's more than Zoom is the important one.
I think this is yours, Luke.
Oh, really? All right, fair enough. Let's have a look. I think what we're looking at is really, when we're talking about usability versus security, I think what we're looking at is kind of how do we strike the right balance? Yeah. And I think a lot of the time previously, we might have an area where it was really high security and decreased usability, and that's typically where bad security professionals kind of default there. And the reason I say that is because they lock down something too heavily, and what we find in that scenario is that user circumvention is likely. So if it's too difficult to use, if it's too secure for users to use, or it has a lack of usability, basically users are going to go outside of that. And a classic example is, look, if you lock down OneDrive, SharePoint sharing to an extreme measure, and people are unable to use that, they're most likely going to try to email that file or use a third-party cloud service to get it out to the person they want to work with. The way I like to look at it is probably better to have good controls and good usability in place, and that's the top right, kind of where we want to be. We want to strike the balance between having a good level of security, but also ensure that it's usable for our clients and customers are the important thing. Otherwise, users are going to go and circumvent that. Now, the other two we've got are really the low security options, and if users are given a choice, I'm not sure they'll really take the high security option unless we really kind of help guide them down it. And I think that the bottom left one is probably the worst: low security and terrible usability, and everyone suffers. And at that point, the trouble's bound to follow, is what we would say.
Brilliant. Okay, so as a user, let's look at some of the use cases that I have. And I think it's, it goes without saying really that the last 18 months have shown us that users need to be able to work from anywhere. And actually, it's not just about working from anywhere, it's also working on any device as well. And when the whole world shifted to remote work, we saw a few different things happen. And some of these things actually are still issues now with the chip shortage that we see, but we saw huge device shortages worldwide. So people were having to connect to Office apps like Teams using their mobile or tables or old laptops. Anecdotally, I've talked to, family members whose kids were having to connect to school classes on Teams on their phone, which is just an impossible way to work. But also as a user, I need to be able to work from home. I need to be able to work on the move. And when we're allowed again, I need to be able to work back in the office. And ideally, the experience should be more or less the same regardless. I need to be able to work from my bed. I need to be able to work from my kitchen table, my desk, wherever I need to, really. And I also need confidence as a user that only the right people have got access to my content so that I can collaborate safely and securely. And it doesn't matter whether this is with my internal colleagues, so, whether it's me and Luke working, or whether it's with external partners in an external facing team. Whether it's me working and collaborating with someone in a Teams meeting or a chat, or whether they're invited into a team as a guest, a fully fledged guest in my environment, ideally I need to be able to work with all of them in a way that is productive and not obstructive, so not stopping me from getting the work done. And, again, as a user, I also need to be able to collaborate securely with other organisations. And what that means is that I actually need my IT admins to have set up all the right configuration and controls, which are going to allow me to do work with external people securely. And then if I think about data, it needs to be protected. And ideally, it needs to be protected for me. Because the typical end user they're not a records manager, they're not a compliance specialist. And then they're not going to know what different retention rules or sensitivity controls apply. So ideally, I just want to be able to work in the right team with my colleagues and automatically have my data looked after for me, and know that it's all going to be fine and safe and protected.
And I think from my side, if we look at it not from the user perspective, but if we take more an admin sort of view, I think these are all valid points and things we should certainly take into consideration, certainly from admin architecture side. But the things for me is, I want this for my users, but how do I maintain control? How do I maintain governance over an environment where I have all these different interactions and collaborations going on? How do I basically manage, or how do I facilitate self-service and allow my users to do as much as possible while maintaining kind of security? And how do I do this at scale? It is probably the key question. So it's just thinking about, what do I need to do to help support my users to achieve kind of their needs, really?
Okay, so if we look at responsibilities, I think a really key question is, whose responsibility is it to keep people safe? And if we just forget about teams and technology for a second, we're just going to use an analogy that kind of puts this into perspective. So I want you to imagine that you're driving on a long dark road on a rainy night, and if you're driving 20 miles an hour over the speed limit and then you fail to hit the brakes when the car in front of you comes to a stop suddenly, is it your fault or is it the manufacturer's fault if you rear end the car that's in front of you? And when we drive, we just seamlessly understand that there are some things that we depend on the manufacturer to provide. So brakes that work, airbags that deploy. And there are some things that we, as the driver, are responsible for, using the brakes when we need to, or not turning off the airbag protection. And, you know, when customers have got their on-prem IT estate, they've got complete responsibility to protect the data and to implement all of the controls necessary to comply with, you know, the compliance standards and, you know, get the perimeter in place and keep everything safe. And when organisations move to cloud services, they lessen the burden that they have, sometimes quite considerably as well, because the cloud represents a shared responsibility between the customer and the cloud service provider. So in this case, Microsoft. And if you're using software as a service like Microsoft 365 or Office 365, you know, Microsoft helps you take care of a lot of the controls. So, you know, things like physical infrastructure and networking, so that customers don't need to spend resources building their own data center or setting up network controls. But it's absolutely, you know, it's completely unfair to think that Microsoft will take care of everything, because they don't have full responsibility in the same way that, you know, as a driver, you obviously know that you need to put the brakes on.
And I think taking a view on kind of a technical perspective here, I think this one is the shared responsibility produced by Microsoft to help kind of break down exactly what they're responsible for in terms of Microsoft 365. Now, like Zoe said, you can see on the left-hand side, we have kind of customer management risk. In the blue, it's entirely on the customer. But say we move to Microsoft 365, what we're looking at is the SaaS column on the far right. And I think what we're looking at is kind of customer management risk and shared management of risk, because those are the things that we're going to really care about. And the things I'm looking at are basically data classification and accountability. So the things that reside within the SaaS platform, Microsoft are saying that we need to classify, and accountability of the data. So we need to own our data. The next one is kind of a shared responsibility, and that's client and endpoint protection. So the devices that are accessing the service, we have a shared responsibility with Microsoft as to how they're set up and protected. And the final one, which is probably one of my favorites, is the identity and access management. So how do we control kind of which users can access what within the system, and how can we do that in, I guess, a usable and secure manner is really the key here. Now, when I look at kind of how to better secure kind of Microsoft Teams and, you know, how can I make it usable and secure at the same time? I think the first thing to understand is typically, what are we trying to secure? So typically when I'm looking at any sort of technical problem, whether, you know, it's Teams, whether it's A5 security, whether it's, you know, whatever piece of technology, the things I'm usually asking are the who, what, why, when, where. It may seem relatively simple, but the thing for me is that I kind of want to understand first and foremost, what is it I'm trying to secure? And Teams is not just, you know, one given single component, it is the way I put it. So when we start looking at Microsoft Teams, this is a high level architecture of how Teams is basically architected behind the scenes. Now, what you can see, there's a whole heap of things here that are there. And we've got Microsoft Teams services, we've got Skype services, and that's the public Skype, so not Skype for Business, but the Skype that Microsoft acquired way back when. And we have kind of Azure and Microsoft 365 services. In the Microsoft 365 services, what we can see is we've got Azure Active Directory, we've got Stream, we've got most recent files, we've got Exchange, we've got SharePoint, we've got OneDrive, we've got the web app companions, we've got OneNote, we've got connectors, we've got Exchange Online protection, we've got a whole heap of things that go into this is the thing. And, you know, most of these, I believe, run in microservices in Azure. Certainly the team stuff is the way that works. But I think what we're really trying to showcase here is the different kind of workloads that go into making Teams. And the reason that we kind of really want to know that is we need to understand what are the different components to how to understand to better secure them is really the one. Now, the next section is really kind of what are the different components that we would look at when we're securing Teams, and kind of what will we do to secure them. And basically, Zoe, feel free to chime in whenever if you want to get in from the usability side,
Yeah, don't worry, I will do.
Zoe usually comes up with a few questions along the way to try to pose me some challenges from kind of a user perspective. This is me just kind of thinking through the key areas that I would look to secure from a Microsoft Teams perspective is the one. Now, as we saw on the previous slide, a lot of this stuff is really going to be around identity and access management, which is in the shared responsibility model. We also have endpoint protection, and we also had data classification, and I think accountability was the other one. So those are the three kind of key areas that I'm looking when I'm looking to secure Microsoft Teams. Now, what I've got is different technology areas, and I wanted to kind of give you some high-level recommendations of things that you could implement here and now to better secure Teams while, you know, ever so slightly, or keeping the same level of usability is really what we want to do. So we want to have the most minimum impact on a user as possible while increasing the security and support those use cases that Zoe kind of highlighted a minute ago. Now, for me, one of my favorite technologies that we have available to play with is kind of Azure AD conditional access. Now, what this is again, one of my favorites is the who, what, why, when, where, and it's kind of how we access our data in Microsoft 365. So conditional access, what it really is a series of if this, then that statements within how we access our data. Now, what we've got here is kind of a diagram of how we might use conditional access. And again, it might be a user and they might want to access kind of Teams, whatever service we want to highlight, but Teams in this instance. And we can use conditions such as their location. It can be an IP range. It can also be based on the GPS location, which is a new feature that they've introduced recently. It can be on a device state, so we can say what kind of state is this device in? Is it managed? Is it unmanaged? Is it BYOD? Is it hybrid Azure AD joined versus Azure AD joined? Who is the user? What is the identity of this user? Do they belong to the special secret squirrel group, or are they a guest user? And the final one, which is a bit fancier, but I'll come to on the next slide, is a risk of assigning or a user. And on the back of that, on these conditions, we can use these to kind of control how they access the data, and I guess if they can access the data. So we can allow, we can enforce MFA, we can apply session controls if we want, so different things that can interact, or different things that can control what a user can do within a session of accessing Microsoft Teams or SharePoint Online, for example. Alternatively, could block access, and if you start making use of Microsoft Intune, we can wipe the device and additional things like that. Now, the one that I like to layer on top of conditional access quite often, and I will call out kind of the licensing implications of these, but the one that I would typically recommend that you work in conjunction with conditional access is going to be identity protection is the one. So Microsoft deal with an enormous amount of signals per day. So they have 6.5 trillions, and I'm pretty sure this comes from the Live network, Xbox Live. It comes from, you know, the standard Microsoft accounts, so your typical consumer Microsoft accounts. You've got all the Office 365, Azure authentications, all feeding into one, and basically they can analyze this at scale. So it is really big data is the key, and they can better understand when a sign-in may be considered risky. Now, the things that they kind of often look for are things such as anonymous IP addresses. They can look for unfamiliar sign-in properties, which I quite like. So if Luke is always signing in on a MacBook using Firefox, and he suddenly changes to a Windows device and he's using Chrome, then that could be considered unfamiliar sign-in properties. It could be basically a typical travel, which is another quite a familiar one with, you know, sign-in properties. But if Luke is authenticating from Reading in the UK, pretty much for the last 6 months, and then, you know, 3 hours later he's coming in from Nigeria, then obviously that might be flagged as a higher risk kind of sign-in at that point. The other ones they've got are quite easy, but it's malware-linked IP address, so known bad actors and kind of leaked credentials that may have been already in the internet, and password spray attacks are the ones. But the real powerful thing about this is that these risk signals can be fed into things such as conditional access and Sentinel to kind of trigger remediation and further investigation. So the things I like here in terms of the risk-based conditional access use case, this is really powerful stuff. It helps better protect our users. It is working in the background. It's not something that you would have to do a great deal on. It's only really when things are flagged as high risk is the important thing. And again, we can let the system take care some of that load is the thing. So if we had a user that was signing in, say, we'll call Zoe out, and if, say, Zoe was, she was flagged as high risk, and because she was coming over the Tor network, for example, what we could do is we could block her access and force a password reset and basically enforce MFA or something of that nature is the one. So we can basically use those sign-in signals to feed into the conditional access, so the who, what, why, when, where of how we access our data. Now, the other things I would probably call out, and I'll call them out on the next page, but with most of the technology areas, what I would like to do is kind of offer some recommendations that I would typically take away as the thing. So some of these are probably a no-brainer, and I'm sure most of you already have them, but it's always worth stressing the importance of these, because some of them, you know, I have dealt with customers out there that still don't have MFA enabled is the one. So if you take anything away today, just make sure that you use conditional access basically to enable MFA. Now, there are a few different ways of doing this. You can build your own custom ones if you have the right license level. So it's an Azure AD Premium P1. The identity protection stuff comes under the P2. But if you have, say, Microsoft 365 Business Premium, you can still make use of custom conditional access policies. If you just have a standard E3, you can use something called the security baselines in Azure AD. And that is basically a set of pre-built conditional access rules. And that will, again, secure you with MFA. So I would say, look, the key thing is either get your security baseline switched on, or basically build a custom conditional access rule to enable MFA. The other things I would look to do, and again, this next one, disable legacy auth. So legacy auth is basically the old way of authenticating, and it's basically a simple username and password. It's non-interactive, the sign-in. So the new sign-ins with, I think it's MSAL authentication library is the latest and greatest. We had ADAL, we've got MSAL now. So what this is it allows that interactive sign-in. So the ability to prompt for authentication from a multi-factor device, the ability to enter codes that you might get from your authenticated device, the ability to use a security key. This is basically interactive sign-in versus legacy sign-in. And I know legacy sign-in was supposed to go for Exchange Online. I think COVID pushed it back. But the other key thing I would look to do is probably disable legacy auth. Again, there's some nice reports in Azure AD that you can use that helps identify where legacy authentication is coming from. Another key one that's very easy to get going with is if your company organization works with only within a specific country, you may wish to introduce an allow list of where users can sign in. Or if you want to be a bit more on the safe side and say your users are all over the globe, typically what we recommend is kind of blocking, you know, some known bad actors. So typically, I think the ones that the National Cybersecurity Centre for England, or for the UK, I should say, recommend are China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. I think are the four that they typically recommend to put on your block list. And again, the amount of noise you can cut out of people trying to authenticate from these countries is quite easy just using a simple block list here. I think the other one is use device-driven controls, and this is a bit more advanced, but I like this one as you can use a device and the compliance level or the management state of that to act as another form of authentication. And those are the kind of the top tips I would take away. The other one I always like talking about now is continuous access evaluation, and that basically is constantly polling to make sure you are meeting the criteria of conditional access to stay in. So if I was setting up conditional access on a new tenant, I would be looking to kind of use these or the security baseline to basically best secure your Microsoft Teams instance as a starter for 10, and that would be the one I would take away for this.
So just on this, Luke, if we just come back to you know, our end user perspective, I think you've touched on some really great things that people can configure. Can we just explain how this actually keeps me safe as an end user? And I think more importantly, actually, you know, if I'm Joe Bloggs from a company who's working at home, how is this going to change my user experience?
That's a good question. It's a good question. I think from keeping your users more secure, I think it's really key that, you know, you're told never to share your password. And I think it's very similar to this is what I would say. So in terms of increasing security for an end user, you know, it's going to prevent unauthorized access to their account because it's no longer just a single form of authentication. We're looking to make use of multi-factor authentication is the key. And the second part of the question was, how will it affect an end user's experience? And I think for me, it can be relatively painless depending on how you set it up. So we would recommend the use of Microsoft Authenticator app, and it's a simple push notification to approve is the other part I'd recommend. So you can simplify it to the following. You can use device-driven controls as another form of authentication. Your user wouldn't even have to do anything there. They just need to have a device that's joined to Azure AD, or hybrid Azure AD joined or domain joined, and co-managed basically in that last instance. They don't even have to do anything there. As long as you're using device-driven controls, you can make it more secure immediately, is what I would say. So the other one, allow or block countries. That, again, is really a no-brainer. It's very easy. Users won't know any difference. as long as they're not coming from, say, one of the banned list countries that you put. So as long as your users aren't coming from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, you should be good, and there'll be no noticeable difference to your users. The disabled legacy auth one, it may be a bit more sticky, but what I'd recommend in terms of making a seamless transition for users is use that report up front to ensure that you've highlighted any instances of legacy auth and try to help get them on the way to multi-factor auth or interactive sign-ins before you pull the trigger, is what I would say on that one, Zoe.
Brilliant.
All right, next one. And again, a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about is really identity and access is the thing, because these underpin the way that you work and interact with Microsoft Teams is the important thing. One of the next ones that I would call out is really Azure AD access reviews. And this one's really quite key. And I think it calls back to kind of the one that Zoe called out previously, which was around, I want to make sure that only the right people have access to the data that I'm working with. And it doesn't matter if they're internal or external is the important thing. What we can do with Azure AD access reviews, and this is kind of Azure AD Premium P1 feature. Actually, no, tell a lie, it's P2, my apologies. But the idea here is that we can create an access review for our users. So say you're working within Microsoft Teams, we can have it so we create an access review on that Microsoft team. And basically, it's going to go, and every X amount of time, whether that's 90 days, 180 days, 360 days, whatever you want to configure, basically we'll do a review on kind of the group membership. So who's in this team and who should actually have access. Now, this can be nominated individuals of that team, it could be managers, or it could be a self-review. And the really powerful thing around this system is going to be basically that the system can make recommendations based on usage. So the system's intelligent enough to say, hey, look, these guys aren't using the system anymore, or the team. Do we want them to continue to have access is the important thing. And again, what you're going to see here is that results are applied, so access renewed or removed. And the idea is we're kind of putting less burden on the admin and more on our users. And the thing that we can make use of here is really that system-based recommendations. And that's what I would recommend on Azure AD access reviews to better do this. And again, this is really cool and really powerful stuff for guests is the other one. So you may want to set up your guest reviews for guest users specifically is the one to see who outside your organization has access to your data. But for me,
I think for me that's absolutely the best bit of this feature, isn't it? Because I think all too frequently, people set teams up, they add people in, but how many people are going and checking on a monthly basis that the external person or even the internal, that the person they were working with 6 months ago is still completely right and valid to be in that team and to have access to it. So anything we can do to help them, prompts them to think about that is just fantastic.
And I mean, I'll be honest, in most organizations we go to, the sort of stuff never really happens unless it's an audit that's taking place. People aren't going to go out their way to kind of tidy people out. It rarely, I would say, happens. In organizations I've been, typically they would just ask IT to go add additional people into that. And this is kind of what access reviews helps to better, I guess, self-service and help our users better manage their own information. And the idea is we try to make it not too strenuous. So I wouldn't spam them to death with access reviews either, and I would make use of the system recommendation. Now, the next thing is really quite powerful, and it's one that I really like, but it kind of goes off the back of access reviews, and it's something called entitlement management. Now, this is an identity governance feature that enables organizations to manage identity and access lifecycle at scale, and it's by automating access request workflows, access assignments, reviews, and expiration. Now, I know that sounds like a lot of governance, but the key thing here is that imagine you're working in teams, and imagine, I think this is quite a common scenario, I know it is for me, but imagine you're in 20, 30, 40, 50 teams. And the thing is, when you're trying to manage them at that kind of volume, it can get quite tricky. And the way that kind of entitlement management works is it's looking to build access packages, and these could be teams, it could be 365 groups, it could be SharePoint sites, it can be applications. The idea is that we can bundle distinct elements of 365 together and manage them as a single access package. And this, again, could be used for internal users or guests. And I think the really cool thing that we've got here is basically, imagine you have people coming and going, leaving the organization. They could just join an access package for HR. They could join an access package for IT. The idea is that you can bundle these kind of containers access requests all into one container and manage it at a higher level, which is something that I think was sorely needed. So I love this one. An absolute shed load is what I would say. I think
for this one as well. I mean, I love this for kind of new starters and leavers because it simplifies that whole process. But I think where this really comes into its own actually is when people move around the organisation, because imagine you work somewhere for 2 years, you're added to a boatload of teams and sites, and some of them might be, it might be like a community of interest that you're in. You might be in a team for like people who like to cycle, or a women's network or something like that, so there's some things that are kind of independent to the job that you do. And if you move from one part of the business to another, you can just literally remove one of the entitlements and add the new one, and it takes care of all the work related systems, and they can keep everything else. So it just, that it simplifies that whole headache from a compliance perspective.
And I think the other thing is, on top of that, these access packages have that access review feature on top. So the one that we saw on the previous slide, again, we can add an access review onto kind of an access package. So again, we can get the business to really better manage who should have access. And at the end of the day, they're the guys that know best. It's not IT. We don't know who should be in what team and who should have access. It really is kind of a business-driven decision, that one. And the other one that I wanted to call out on this is kind of, it's a new feature that we saw maybe a week or two ago come in, and I think it was separation of duties. So you can have it, so it's like an information wall or an information barrier for applications, is another really cool one. So I may be in sales, and we might have it that I'm not allowed to access financial auditing applications, and we can use entitlement management to kind of build up those separation of duties, which again is another cool feature. Not so heavily related to teams, but I think the key use case here for teams is really better managing access to the teams that we have out there and doing it at scale, and basically enabling self-service and helping our users to basically make better informed decisions around who should have access to what team, or if we're working in entitlement management, which access package, as it were. Now, the next one I was going to cover is, again, we're looking at kind of Azure AD, but we're looking at 365 groups is the key one. So whenever we're thinking about securing the technology, and we're kind of looking at the life cycle of it, is the way I kind of look at it. And I think for me, we really want to better understand kind of who can create groups and who can create teams by that virtue. And I think there's no one size fits all, but there are some sensible things that we would recommend. And the things that we would typically recommend is, even if you don't want to put an approval process in on your teams, we would recommend typically incorporating some sort of automated process that can basically apply your governance when you create these teams. And the governance may be as simple as, a naming convention. It may be asking for 2 owners of that team. The thing is, what we're trying to do is help our users build better teams in a more controlled and governed way. And we may just have it self-approved is the thing. I think what we'd recommend is, at minimum, the self-approve, and at least put that in place, or put the kind of governance at the point of creation in place for 365 groups and teams by that virtue. And again, the real kind of one that I would recommend here is, because if you switch guest access on in Microsoft Teams, it's going to be basically switched on for every team moving forward. So use the scenario that you're looking for. Most likely not no, is what I would say. But there are ways around that I'll come to a bit later, that you can kind of have your team's owners kind of control that. But you probably want to basically have a better handle on that. And again, even if it's self-approval, we would recommend just having, a Power Automate, maybe a simple Microsoft Forms in front of it that basically calls the Graph API and basically sets these things up for your users.
Yeah, I think, if we come back to some of the points that we made at the start as well, the end users, they don't know what the right thing is to do here. So if you just allow anybody in the organisation to create a team, they won't understand what a naming convention is. They won't understand all of the different options. So by putting this in between, by still letting them self-serve, but putting this in the middle, you're making sure that they're doing the right thing without them actually even having to think about it.
Yeah, and I like the way you say it, Zoe. It is what I would say. I think that's, it's the users don't always know what they're looking for, and they probably won't have a clue on the technical kind of decisions behind the scenes. So anything we can do to make that easier and keep them more secure when we do it, so much the better, is what I would say. The next one, I kind of touched on it previously, but guest access is a real key one for 365 groups. And again, I know this session is on Teams, But when we're talking about guest access, what we really have to look at is the kind of underlying currency for collaboration in Microsoft 365, which is kind of a Microsoft 365 group. So guest access, and we want to enable safe teamwork outside the organization. It works with any email address, and it's based on kind of B2B. Now, the things that I would recommend that we do typically with guest access is I would normally recommend you switch on guest access today. And the reason I would say that is, again, it calls back to that kind of usability versus security kind of discussion. And we don't want to be, I think, is the bottom right, whereas basically, it's too locked down for users to use. It's very highly secure. So if you shut down guest access altogether, how are users going to work with people externally, and where is that collaboration going to take place? It won't be taking place in Teams, that's for sure. If you lock them down, is what I would say. So I think it's better to offer the facility to have guest users, but how you control it is kind of up to you, and how kind of easy you want to make it for users as well. So I've been to organizations where we have an allow list for guests and people can invite them in. I've had different organizations, heavily restricted organizations, kind of police forces, for example, where you might have an admin invite guests in, but there is still that ability to work with guests. So the recommendation there is switched on guest access. I think the other things I would recommend here is, guest access, I know I've called it by that. For external access is the other key one to look at when you're working in Teams. I would strongly recommend basically switching on external access as well. And again, that can be governed through an allow or a deny list. And that's the ability to chat, call, and kind of communicate with people outside your organizations. So not necessarily a guest. The next one is, I would say, govern kind of guest accounts using the built-in tools. And the ones I would really look at there are going to be the things such as, access reviews and entitlement management. So can we make better use of these tools to basically help manage the guest accounts within our organization? Again, what we want to do is restrict or reduce the amount of administrative effort on IT administration and also on our users. So that's why I'd recommend, if you have the tools available, why not make use of them? Set up kind of access reviews, set up entitlement management, access reviews at a minimum, just to help kind of better facilitate that. And I think the final one, I think group assignments, I think what I was trying to say here is probably group exploration is the one. I think there's another interesting one that I might call out in this instance, but another good one of helping manage groups and the life cycle of them is going to be group exploration. And again, it's another feature that's in P1, but if a group's no longer being used, it is probably better to let it expire and then have retention policies kick in and take hold. So in summary, on the 365 groups, I would typically basically set up a way of better controlling how they're created, even if it's self-approval. We get some guest access going, let you guys work with guests, otherwise they're probably going to find a different way around it. I know certainly we found that in the past. We'll find Dropboxes spun up for people working outside of an organization, and the rest are kind of the higher tier premium stuff, which is basically access reviews, entitlement management, and that's what I would do on the 365 groups. Now, sorry, do you have anyone on guests?
No, nothing to add at this point.
All right, cool. So that was kind of the first piece, which is identity and access management. The next part I wanted to talk about briefly was really around how do we better classify our data. So again, we're going back to that shared responsibility model. And I think the thing here is, data classification and accountability was all on us. So on the customer entirely. So whatever we put in 365, basically Microsoft saying is we're wholly responsible for that. And how do we support our users, and how do we better help them to classify their data? Now, the one I would typically always recommend you guys use is kinds of sensitivity labels. And I think, what is a sensitivity label to start with? It's a tag that's customizable, it's clear text, and it's persistent. So what do we mean? By persistent, we mean it lives with the document is the important thing. It lives with that document wherever it travels. Whoever you send it to, this kind of sensitivity label is going to live with that document. So the content that you're storing within Microsoft Teams, we can basically apply these tags, and basically these tags become the basis for applying and enforcing data protection policies. And this stuff is really powerful. I really like this stuff in terms of working with kind of third parties. It doesn't really matter so much as where your data lives. It just matters that you've tagged it is the important thing. So even if one of these files, if you look on the right, we've got a few sensitivity labels set up here. Sensitivity labels are built into the Office client. You can install the Azure Information Protection client if you like, but you can get going here and now just using sensitive labels and a recent version of the Office client. Now, what we've got is the default Microsoft ones in the demo on the right, but the great thing here is when we mark something as highly confidential, we can encrypt that document and mark it basically for specific users, specific domains. So the usual one that we talk about is if we tag something as, you could create a tag or a sensitivity label, Project Treadstone, and that could only be restricted to, a set number of users within your organization. And it doesn't matter if a user takes that document onto a USB stick and takes it out of the organization. The idea there is that that protection lives with the document and we can have it expire after a period of time. Now, the really interesting one for me is sensitivity labels can be applied at the document, which we've kind of just seen on the right, and groups and sites and Azure Purview. Now, I'm not going to talk about Azure Purview, but the real exciting one for teams is really sensitivity labels applied at the container level is the one. So I think the things I would say about sensitivity labels at the document, I would get going with them. They're fairly easy. Users will probably get the hang of them, but I have some tips to kind of better roll that out in a bit and some recommendations. The one that I really like for teams is container level kind of sensitivity labels. And this is absolutely crazy in my mind. This is so cool. And we've been kind of dying for this one. So we can apply these same labels, which I wouldn't recommend doing exactly the same labels, but we can apply sensitivity labels to a container. And upon changing that sensitivity of a Microsoft team, we can control different things that happen within that team. So we can basically control external access or guest user access to that team. We can control external sharing to the SharePoint files, and we can also implement some light touch conditional access for basically access from unmanaged devices. Now, why is this really powerful, you might ask? I think the really powerful thing here is that we could ask a user when they're asking for a team, we could ask, what is the sensitivity of this site? Is it going to be highly confidential information? Is it going to be, public or out in the open? We don't really mind. It's like Zoe said, a bicycle club. We don't really mind. In which case, we can apply a different sensitivity label to that Microsoft team. But the idea here is we could prompt our basically team requesters or team owners for what the sensitivity label is, and that will automatically apply protection depending on the choice they choose. Now, of course, there is obviously human error here, but we can kind of counteract that with some of the stuff in E5, but I'll come to that in a minute. The thing here,
just on sensitivity labels, Luke. So,
go for it.
At the start we were talking about some of the different use cases that we've got for our end users, and the fact that over the last 18 months, people have had to work from different places, different devices and things like that. So, if I'm an end user logging on to like an unmanaged mobile and we've got things that are tagged with sensitivity labels, is that going to give me a different experience in terms of what I can and can't do?
So it's a good question. It really, on the document level, I would say no is the important thing. So the document level, the really nice thing is it's tied to your identity is the thing. So what it's really looking for is, are you, a listed user? So imagine, you're working from an internet cafe. Somehow, by miraculous, they have Office Pro Plus or a recent version of Office in this scenario, or it could be from the web client. Now, the web client isn't too fancy, but the important thing, imagine you take that document, you open it on your home PC, it'll ask you to authenticate with Azure AD, and as long as your credentials are good, you'll be able to work on that document. Is the great thing. So that's why I really like this one. So it doesn't matter so much where the document goes or where the document lives. It's still tied to that identity, and that label that it persists with the document is the really cool stuff. So again, your users don't care too much, or they shouldn't care too much. It's again asking for a simple prompt, a simple login to basically work on the document, and that will give them access, whatever device they're working on. And again, if it's a general document, if it's not very high priority, we might not have encryption, we might not have watermarks applied, in which case there would be no difference to a user. So the real key thing here is we can increase the sensitivity of the documents or the content that we're storing, and it could be relatively painless to a user if they're on an existing corporate managed device, or it may be an additional login prompt if we are coming from basically an unmanaged device. Now, what else was I going to say? Thank you for the question, Zoe. I think for me, in terms of recommendations and what you could do to better basically get going with this today and help improve kind of the security and hopefully the usability of your Microsoft Teams environment is really this. If you're using Azure Information Protection previously, migrate them over to sensitivity labels. It's kind of what we're using now in Microsoft 365. I would recommend configuring a baseline for sensitivity labels for both the item and container level. Now, I would typically recommend not creating exactly the same labels for a container and a document because they might not really stack up. So it may be that you have containers of sensitive, maybe confidential, it may be public, but you might not want exactly the same containers or the same labels for a container or a Microsoft team. The reason being is you want to make sure that it's easy to understand for your users. So it may be that you have a team that's external and internal, and those are the container labels you have. And that makes it kind of easy for your users to understand. If they mark a Microsoft team as an internal team, it's going to change the kind of sharing levels and the guest access level of that group. I think if you're using the default labels, I'd recommend reviewing the descriptions and settings. The reason being is Microsoft come up with one that's called public, and it might not be entirely clear if it's it should be out in the public, or no, actually, sorry, it's personal is the one I think it is. So is that a personal document to me, or is it containing personal information? That's the one, sorry. And I think Microsoft's definition is that it's personal to me. It's not corporate information, whereas some people might interpret that as PII or something that might fall out of the GDPR. So I just recommend reviewing the kind of default labels out there. I would restrict who can create public and external groups by publishing the labels. So we can control who gets these labels, and you can kind of control who would be able to change a container label is another recommendation I'd make. If you're rolling out for the first time, we would typically recommend scoping out to a pilot group, train them how to use the labels on kind of the container side and also on the document side. And then also behind the scenes, you can see what labels are being used versus what aren't. And the other key one that you might want to make use of is if you have the license scope, so if you have some of the higher license SKUs, we can have automatic classification of documents. So we have trainable classifiers, and we also have kind of automatic labeling. So again, you might have our favorite project Treadstone. So again, if a user might mention the word project Treadstone in their document, we could automatically apply a label to that document. And again, this is really that kind of top right box, I think it was, where it's increased security and increased usability. Your users aren't having to understand, they've entered project Treadstone, it's going to automatically protect the document for them. And for me, that's really powerful. And that's kind of where we want to be, is the 1.1 sensitivity labels. But obviously, it's not available to everyone because that's locked behind the E5, unfortunately. Now, that's kind of information classification. There is a whole piece around retention, but that's more about how long we retain a piece of information as opposed to, how we protect a piece of information. So the final one, and I appreciate I'm coming out to we've got about 5 minutes left. The typical last one that I want to talk about is really that endpoint protection and the data on there. So we can use data loss prevention in kind of Microsoft 365 to better find kind of sensitive content in your organization, stop accidental sharing of the sensitive information outside of Microsoft Teams, for example, and better educate our users and kind of understanding of how much of this data is being protected and kind of what are the sensitive information types out there. Now, we do get an inbuilt DLP, and that covers Exchange, OneDrive, SharePoint. What it unfortunately does not cover is Microsoft Teams. Is the biggest killer here, unfortunately. So we can use data loss prevention in Microsoft Teams to automatically block messages which contain sensitive information. We can pop up with kind of a policy tip like we can see on the right. This message was blocked, and basically it's a person sharing some credit card information. We have a whole bunch of inbuilt sensitive information types that we can make use of. Now, my understanding from Microsoft is the reason it's in the E5 SKU is because it has to do it in real time. So with other DLP, it kind of makes use of the SharePoint search engine in the background, but this is going to have to do it real time because it's instant messaging. So that is, I think, the understanding as to why they've done it that way. But again, if you have E5, certainly get DLP switched on for Microsoft Teams is what I'd recommend. Again, to better protect your users and basically help educate as to what we should be sharing and what we shouldn't be sharing. The next one is data loss prevention for endpoint. And again, this is kind of I would say the one that's come along since kind of Windows information protection, which is kind of BYOD and protecting information on a BYOD device. This one isn't so much around BYOD, but the idea is it's protecting from data loss on endpoints. So it's a better way of controlling kind of client devices, which is another shared responsibility from Microsoft. And the things that we can do here are pretty damn awesome. So we can stop people printing out a document. We can stop them copying it to network shares. We can stop you copying kind of over a remote session. So again, what we're doing is increasing security. Obviously, the usability might be decreased slightly because they might be used to copying, or, I don't know many people copying over Bluetooth, but maybe we don't want them copying over network share or removable USB media. Or the key one for me probably is the upload to cloud service or access by unallowed browsers. So it's a better way of kind of controlling our users while keeping the usability there within the boundaries that we want to define and set.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look at usability, I think this is we want to allow people to be able to work effectively, but actually some of the examples that we just looked at there, such as being able to copy to removable USB drives, just because people have been used to doing something previously doesn't make it right. So, we're not trying to kind of let them work in exactly the way that they are now. It's about keeping them safe and working in the way that we want them to. But if there are things that they're doing that are dangerous, we absolutely should be stopping that and helping them get to what good practice looks like.
Yeah, thank you, Zoe. Wonderful. And I think for me, the takeaway for the recommendation for data loss prevention, typically what I'd recommend is wherever you're coming from in the world, that they have a good amount of sensitive information types built in. I think what I'd recommend is typically set up 2 baseline policies in your data loss prevention, one for say under 10 instances of shared data and one for over 10 instances of shared or of sensitive information types. Apologies. And the reason being is we want to, maybe with the one under 10, we kind of want to flag with our users, we'll probably still let them share that data externally, but we might want to educate them and help them understand, you're sharing sensitive data outside the organization. Is this what you meant to do? Whereas if it's over 10, if it's over 100, we may want to block access to that and have an administrator take a look at it. So that's kind of the recommendations for DLP. And I think what I would say is that's kind of it for today in terms of usability versus security. I hope we covered off those kind of 3 areas in the shared responsibility model, and we kind of helped I'm sure quite a few already know the features, but it's interesting to see how they can be applied while still helping to kind of retain that usability. So as ever, guys, thank you very much for listening. I appreciate you listening to me and Zoe waffle on. If you've got any questions, then please feel free to shout, is what I would say.
Brilliant. I think just one more thing to finish off as well. I think we've seen some really great technical examples, and it is possible to balance usability and security. But as with a lot of things Microsoft do, I think there is a catch. And for some of the things that we've looked at, like Luke's articulated, there are license uplifts required. So some of these things require Azure ADP2. Some things you kind of get that best, overall protection if you actually look at E5 or EMS E5, M365 E5, something like that. But yeah, that is a little bit of a gotcha. There's a lot that you can do with standard licenses, I think, but to get the best balance for usability and security, there typically does need to be some form of license uplift.
Yeah, and Zoe is spot on. In this scenario, unfortunately, you can't really have your cake and eat it at the lowest license tier, unfortunately. So yeah, cool. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Zoe. Okay, so let's take a look at the questions. Looks as though there aren't any questions as of yet. It was a very comprehensive session, I must say. You did cover a lot there. It was non-stop.
Hopefully we've not overwhelmed people.
I'm hopeful we didn't pitch it too low level or anything like that, or there was too much to cover. Yeah.
I think it was exactly what they needed, really. And it really complemented all the sessions that we've done today. So definitely, I like the fact that you covered a wide-spanning architecture and the different elements and scopes of considerations. So yeah, it was very, very comprehensive. So yeah, we still got people online. So Namisha's been on since the morning, since 9 o'clock in the morning, and see Namisha still online. So thank you, Namisha, for your kind feedback there. So there's people that have been on here since I think 8 hours now. So I just want to thank you for this session. Do you have any comments or any final notes you'd like to make? Any announcements or anything?
Just to say thank you for having us. It's been a pleasure. It's quite a nice way for me to sign off because I'm off for a week now, so I'm logging off after this.
Well, it is holiday season. It is holiday season, so thank you for everyone who's been able to attend today, given it is holiday season. And wish Zoe and Luke a fantastic break as well, and holidays. Thanks again for taking your time out to deliver this and to share your knowledge with the community and enforce better practices, security practices. So thanks once again, Zoe and Luke.
That's quite all right, and unfortunately, I don't have a break. It's only Zoe, so I would love to take you up on that, Raz, but unfortunately, it's not for me.
Yep.
Anyways, thanks a lot, guys, for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me and Zoe on LinkedIn. or Twitter for Zoe, and you can find us there, and we can answer any questions, because I know they might not come immediately. It may be in a couple of days' time. Then please feel free to reach out. And Zoe, I have to say, I haven't seen you on the screen for a bit, so I'm loving the award in the background. Wonderful. Thanks for having us, Raz.
Brilliant. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice evening.
Thank you very much.
Lovely. Cheers. Have a good one, guys. Thank you.
So that was Zoe and Luke. Fantastic. Local from the UK. So we've had people from all over Europe, New Zealand, and our next session's from the USA, from the United States. And then, yes, so we've had a mixture of sessions from all around the world for this boot camp. So thanks for everyone who's managed to stay on for our last two sessions of today. Let's see who is online now. Let's see if Dustin or if Paul is on. Dustin is, I believe. I can see Dustin. Dustin is online. Let's make him a presenter. Hello there, Dustin.
Hey, Raz, how are you today?
Hello there, Dustin. Thank you so much. I'm looking to find Paul.
Patrick Vogner.
Patrick. Sorry. Yes, I can't see him in the user list. You don't know if he's joined yet, do you?
Let me check. I know he was on the way, so.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we still got a few minutes, haven't we? Yeah, we still got a few minutes, Dustin. Yeah, we were just saying to the audience, Dustin, that it's been a very long day today. The event began, I think, almost 11 hours ago, 10 or 11 hours ago. So
that is a long day.
Yeah, it has. And also, it's holiday season as well, right? So people are taking their summer breaks right now. So everyone who stayed online, they're obviously very keen, and we're all very excited to obviously finish off very strong on the last two sessions of the day, being yourself and another session. And there you go. So we can see there's some prizes as well to be won there. So so obviously we're just waiting for Patrick. Oh, I can see Patrick. So let's make Patrick presenter.